We have with us Professor Benjamin Madley of UCLA's Department of History. I'm going to read his bio. Benjamin Madley is an historian of Native America, the United States, and colonialism in world history. He was educated at Yale and Oxford, and he writes about Native Americans as well as colonialism in Africa, Australia, and Europe, often applying a transnational and comparative approach. Professor Madley has authored or co-authored 20 journal articles and book chapters. Yale University Press published his first book, entitled An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe of 1846 through 1873. This book received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for History and the Raphael Lemkin Book Award from the Institute for the Study of Genocide, among many other honors. Also, the book was named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice Book, in addition to several other noteworthy recognitions. In 2018, Professor Madley received the California Commendation Medal from the Military Department of the State of California. According to former California Governor Jerry Brown, quote, Madley corrects the record with his gripping story of what really happened, which was the actual genocide of a vibrant civilization thousands of years in the making, unquote. Additionally, Professor Madley co-edited the Cambridge World History of Genocide, Volume 2, Genocide in the Indigenous, Early Modern and Imperial Worlds, from 1535 to 1914, forthcoming this year in 2023. And he worked on this with historians Ned Blackhawk, Ben Kiernan, and Rebbe Taylor. Professor Madley's current research explores Native American migration and labor in the making of the United States. We are pleased to have with us Professor Madley. Professor, thank you for joining, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Dr. Gover, thank you for that extremely kind introduction. A little bit embarrassing to hear all of that, but I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share some time with all of you this afternoon, and I very much appreciate you inviting me. It's an honor.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay, can folks see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. So before we begin, I just wanted to say a few words by way of preamble. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm over here on the west side of Los Angeles, on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Tongva Gabrielino people, and it is an honor to work on their land and to be a guest here. I also just want to acknowledge that wherever we go in California today, we will be in Indian country. And for that matter, if you get on a plane and you fly just about anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, from the shores of the Arctic Ocean all the way down to the tip of Patagonia, you will be a visitor on someone's ancient and ancestral indigenous territory. And if there's one thing that you take away from our brief time together this afternoon, I hope it's that, just to remember that wherever you go here in the Americas, you're in Indian country. The other thing that I wanted to say is that the material we are going to traverse together this afternoon is pretty rugged stuff. And if at any time during this presentation you feel the need to take a break, to get some fresh air, to go outside and say a prayer, please do so. You're under no obligation to hear this material. It's pretty tough stuff. So I'd like to begin now. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, the celebrants moved together in ancient rhythms, the women's clamshell necklaces clicking softly against their seashell dresses. Male dancers attired as birds, deer, or hunters supported the female dancers in their heavy regalia. Meanwhile, singers raised their voices toward the stars with the songs of Nadash or feather dance. Between songs, singers offered prayers of thanks not only for the original creation of this spectacular world in which we have the privilege to live, but also for its renewal in each and every moment. Finally, the celebrants stopped and walked away arm in arm under a full moon. Nearby, they passed through small, round doorways into redwood plank houses with gently sloping roofs. Outside, Lake Earl lapped gently at the shore. Inside, the Talawadi'ini people and their native guests slept near kith and kin. The celebrants, unaware that less than 7 miles away, Crescent City men had established their own branch of California's spreading killing machine. Crescent City Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers had been well armed by California Governor John Bigler. He had shipped them 20 muskets, 95 rifles, swords, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They now prepared to do one thing and one thing only: kill Native people. In the pre-dawn hours of December 31st, 1854, as many as 116 volunteer state militiamen and an unknown number of volunteer auxiliaries quietly surrounded the village. They took up concealed positions in the brush, in the shadow of large sand dunes, and in the shade of boulders. At daybreak, as women, men, children, and elders emerged to begin the day, the vigilantes and militiamen opened fire. They shot them down as fast as they could reload, says one eyewitness. Possessing only 3 guns, the Talawadi'ini and their guests were unable to effectively defend themselves. A few plunged into Lake Earl. There too, they became targets. Those who swam across encountered a second group of killers laying in wait. When the shooting and the screaming stopped, perhaps hundreds of dead lay on the ground. Not more than 5 people seem to have survived. In contrast, the attackers suffered a single California militiaman casualty, and the state later paid the militiamen for their so-called work. The massacre was part of an American genocide. As you're probably well aware, between 1846 and 1870, California's indigenous population plunged from perhaps 150,000 people to some 30,000 survivors. Diseases, dislocation, and starvation played important roles. However, abduction, unfree labor, mass death on federal Indian reservations, homicides, battles, and more than 300 now documented massacres also took thousands of lives while hindering reproduction. In fact, this was a case of genocide. So what do I mean when I use this politically explosive term? Now, for an international prosecutor to successfully convict a defendant of the crime of genocide, they must prove 2 things beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt. First, they must prove that the defendant exhibited what they call special intent. That is, as you see here, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. But the prosecutor will also have to prove a second factor in order to convict. And that is that the defendant not only exhibited special intent, but also committed one of the 5 genocidal acts enumerated here on this list. The UN Genocide Convention of 1948 thus provides a clear, internationally recognized legal rubric for evaluating instances of genocide, including historical cases not subject to legal jurisdiction. First, perpetrators must have intent to destroy a group as such, and second, they must commit one of the 5 genocidal acts against one of the 4 protected groups. Now, following the formulation of this new international legal treaty, scholars began to carefully rethink and re-examine California's colonization by the United States. And by the beginning of the century in which we live, that is by the year 2000, more than 20 scholars deemed the history here in California to be a case of genocide. Still, when I began working on this book, very little had been written about this genocide, at least compared to other genocides. Building on previous scholarship, this book then is the first comprehensive recounting of of the genocide that took place in California between 1846 and 1873. This topic calls for meticulous attention to detail because the stakes are so high, not only for scholars like ourselves, but also for California Indian people, and in fact, for everyone in the United States. So why is this? Let's first think about what this means for scholarship. If United States citizens founded some regions of California, if not our state as a whole, on deliberate attempts to physically annihilate the state's original indigenous peoples, scholars will need to reevaluate and rethink some of the fundamental axioms upon which California history is built today. Scholars could, for example, re-examine the assumption that it was the indirect effects of colonization, like epidemic disease, rather than deliberate actions, like mass murder, that were the leading cause of death among California's original peoples. Exceptionalist interpretations of US history also begin to lose validity as researchers compare California to other mass killings around the globe and place California in a global colonial context. A careful study of genocide in California can also assist scholars to begin re-examining and rethinking the much larger hemispheric indigenous population catastrophe in the Americas. Where scholars documented genocide, it is necessary to evaluate what roles governments and private individuals played, as well as whether or not the event was part of a recurring regional, national, or hemispheric pattern. And some basic questions begin to emerge. What tended to catalyze genocide? Who ordered the killing? Who bloodied their hands carrying it out? Why do we not know more about such events? Did democracy drive a mass murder? And ultimately, what role did genocide play in the making of modern Canada, Mexico, the United States, and the other nation states of the 21st century Western Hemisphere? As I have found in my many consultations with California tribal people, both on and off reservations, the genocide is particularly urgent question for them. Should the approximately 150,000 California Indian people alive today press for government apologies? What about reparations? And how about control of the land where particular genocidal events took place? Tribal leaders have discussed with me the possibility of marshaling evidence of genocide in cases involving tribal sovereignty and federal recognition. They've also wondered aloud in discussions with me about how they should commemorate the victims of mass murder while at the same time emphasizing successful accommodation, resistance, survival, and current cultural renewal. The psychological issues related to genocide can also be fraught. What happens when a tribal member learns that she is both the descendant of genocide perpetrators and genocide survivors? How can California Indian governments and individuals reconcile increased knowledge of genocide, sometimes at the hands of uniformed agents of the United States, with their often intense patriotism and the highest rates of volunteerism in the United States Armed Forces of any group of Californians? Finally, what role might genocide and acknowledgement of genocide have on the intergenerational historical trauma prevalent in many California Indian communities today, and that trauma's connection to present-day physical illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and the highest rate of youth suicide in California? The question of genocide in California is also pressing for everyone in the United States. I think there are going to be larger issues, not only in the state of California, but at the federal level. Should government officials tender public apologies at the federal level, such as the ones offered by Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush in the 1980s for the forcible relocation and internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II? By the way, most of them were citizens of the state of California. Should federal officials offer monetary compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that Congress has paid out to some 82,000 of these Japanese Americans and to their heirs? Might California officials decrease their cut of California Indians nearly $8 billion a year in annual gaming revenues as a way of paying reparations for the state's role in this genocide. A better understanding of the genocide here might also impact the federal government's dealings with the scores of California Indian communities currently seeking recognition as federal Indian tribes by the United States government. The question of commemoration, I think, is also closely linked. Will non-Indian people support or tolerate the same kinds of public commemoration of mass murder committed by some of the state's forefathers with the types of monuments, museums, and state legislated days of remembrance that today commemorate, for example, the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust? Will genocides against California Indian people join these mass murders in California's public school curricula and public discourse? Now, all of these questions are extremely important. We're talking about land, we're talking about monetary reparations, we're talking about control of resources and the way that the state's history is taught. But we can't really address these questions without a comprehensive understanding of relations between natives and newcomers in California between 1846 and 1873. Sporadic mass killing of California Indian civilians punctuated the initial years of US rule in California. But James Marshall's 1848 gold strike precipitated the first widespread local genocide under US rule. Men coming south from Oregon played a leading role in increasing violence against California Indian people. These Oregonians rarely had connections to California's Hispanic economy and society, in which indigenous peoples played very important roles. And many of these Oregonians saw native people as little more than dangerous obstacles to the rapid acquisition of wealth. In 1849, Oregonian attacks on California Indian people increased in both frequency and lethality, particularly in the central mines, which were then booming. You can see the central mines, they're that middle mining region on this map. One 49er explained in his personal diary, and I quote, "Oregon people had been used to shooting Indians, and in California, they did shoot them freely." That April, a man named Theodore Johnson entered the epicenter of this local genocide, Coloma, at Sutter's Mill, where Marshall's employees had first found gold. In the central mine, Johnson and others recounted multiple massacres, scalpings, and the repeated slaying of surrendered California Indian people. Due to spotty primary source coverage, there weren't any newspapers yet in this region. They had yet to be created. I don't think that we will probably ever know the precise numbers of California Indian people murdered by whites in and around the mines in 1849 and early 1850. But it is quite clear that hundreds, if not thousands, suffered violent deaths during this short period. What was quite clear to observers was the exterminatory nature of such killings, both in their intent and in their impact. In December 1849, Pomo and Wapo people, being held as unfree laborers, rose up and killed their two white captors near Clear Lake. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and United States Army soldiers murdered as many as 1,000 California Indian people or more between Christmas Day 1849 and May 15, 1850. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers of indigenous people in the Napa and Sonoma valleys. Then, after authorities arrested 8 of these vigilantes, California's state Supreme Court let them go on bail in its very first case. This is, by the way, one of the reasons that Hastings Law School was renamed San Francisco Law School on January 1st of this year. Meanwhile, the United States Army also sought to avenge the deaths of the 2 white US citizen ranchers. In a San Francisco newspaper article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," one journalist described a massacre committed by the United States Army on Clear Lake using information provided by a regular United States Army captain, and I quote, "Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither sex nor age were spared was the order of extermination fearfully obeyed, end quote. As many as 800 Wapo and Pomo people, mainly women and children, died that day. Other mass killings followed, and the officers involved were not censured or court-martialed. In fact, all of them received promotion. 3 of them became regular United States Army generals. 1 later became governor of the state of California. A new factor was at work: large-scale extended vigilante and United States Army killing campaigns tolerated by both state and federal authorities. As the gold rush continued, immigrants surged into the state. Before the rush, there were 13 or 14,000 non-Indian people in all of California. 1860 census takers counted more than 360,000. The newcomers came primarily in search of wealth, but in seeking to access gold, eat, dress, acquire labor, and satisfy their rapacious sexual desires, immigrants placed immense pressures on California Indian communities. These demands triggered explosions in large-scale ranching, industrial hunting, mining, and slave raiding. These activities generated shockwaves that had a devastating impact on California Indian people. California's new leaders magnified that impact. Under martial law, US military officers made California Indian people into second-class subjects with few rights. California's 1849 Constitution then made it nearly impossible for Indian people to vote. And in 1850, California's first legislature banned all Indian people from voting, barred Indians with 1/2 of Indian blood or more from giving evidence for or against whites in criminal cases, and banned Indian people from serving as jurors. They later banned all Indian people from working as attorneys. In combination, these laws largely shut Indians out of participation in and protection by the new state's legal system. Abduction played a major role in the California Indian population decline. In the year 1850, legislators passed an Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized white custody of Indian minors and Indian prisoner leasing, while allowing courts and juries to summarily reject Indian testimony at will. Indian people could thus be forced into unpaid work on trumped-up charges. I'll stop for a moment to take a look with you at this handbill here. I had it translated with the help of somebody who's a fluent French speaker. And what this handbill says, it was posted probably around Los Angeles, somewhere in the 1850s. It's an advertisement for selling a 16-year-old female California Indian person. So we can see from this and from the laws passed by the state of California that there was an active trade in unfree California Indian labor. In 1860, legislators expanded that original 1850 Act to legalize the indenture of any Indian. These laws triggered a boom in genocidal kidnapping. So let's imagine just for a moment that we are, as a group, are being assaulted by a group of slave raiders at this time. The first thing that they would do is to kill all of the older men in the room. So that would be your professor and me and maybe some others of you in this room. Anybody who resisted being captured would also generally be summarily murdered. And then survivors would be tied up and taken away to be sold. The slave raiders often already had contracts for purchasers looking for a certain age and gender slave. So that scattering of people would then make it very difficult for our community to reproduce itself either biologically or socially. Some Indian people, once they arrived in these new situations of enslavement, were treated simply as disposable laborers. One lawyer from Los Angeles recollected later, and I quote, "Los Angeles had its weekly slave market, and thousands of honest, useful people were absolutely destroyed in this way," end quote. Census takers prove this point. Between the years 1850 and 1870, LA's California Indian population fell from 3,693 to just 219. Escape was one way that California Indian people defied servitude, but enslavers and their allies sometimes responded with overwhelming lethal force. The Lasik and Wailaki Indian woman Lucy Young, who we see in portrait in the latter years of her life here, she escaped servitude multiple times. She recollected, and I quote, "Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver. Front skin hang down like apron. She tie up with cotton dress, never die neither," end quote. Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled, quote, "her lord and master with his Indian boy in 1858, end quote, whites massacred some 15 California Indian civilians. 2 years later, a rancher on the Van Dusen River became so incensed after his California Indian servant visited his family half a mile away that he, quote, "slaughtered the whole family, about 6 persons, boy and all," end quote. Despite such gruesome reports, policymakers routinely failed to intervene, while almost all California law enforcement officials turned a blind eye to such crimes. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to immigration's blast. In 1851 and 1852, the federal agents you see pictured here signed 18 separate treaties with 119 California Indian tribal communities, allocating them some 7,488,000 acres. So those are the gray areas inside the white areas that you see pictured on this map. Once the treaties reached the United States Senate, however, senators repudiated all of them. Instead, in 1853, Congress authorized, quote, 5 military reservations not exceeding 25,000 acres each, and conferred no legal recognition or land titles. So the first thing that we can see here is that the government's situation in which California tribes have been promised roughly 7.5 million acres to a situation in which at the very best, they can have 125,000 acres, but those 125,000 acres are only to be held temporarily. So what are the larger results? First of all, no reservations were patented, and so legal jurisdiction over those temporary military reservations remained uncertain. Second, because legal jurisdiction remained uncertain, confusion and conflict between and among state and federal authorities prevailed. Third, California Indian people, unlike other nations that signed treaties with the US government, did not become the explicit legal federal wards of the US government. Finally, United States Army Major General John Wool's 1857 interpretation of California reservation legal status denied them Army protection. And I quote, "Until these reservations are perfected, the United States troops have no right to exclude the whites from entering and occupying the reserves, or even to prevent their taking from them Indians, including women and children," end quote. Federal officials thus made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to kidnapping, assault, slavery, and murder. The establishment of California's new militia system now marked the rise of a state-sponsored killing machine. Between the years 1850 and 1861, 3,414 men voluntarily enrolled in 24 militia expeditions, killing an absolute minimum of 1,342 California Indian people. That's an absolute minimum number. But the impact of these killings transcended these numbers. Why? Because militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement of Indian killing, communicating to the public an unofficial grant of legal impunity for Indian killing, and inspiring many more vigilante murders. Indeed, by my reckoning, vigilantes murdered an absolute minimum of 6,400 California Indian people between 1846 and 1873. In January of 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett declared, and I quote, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct, end quote. The following month, California state legislators voted to borrow $500,000 for past and future anti-Indian militia campaigns. This was an extraordinary amount of money at the time, and by far the single largest line item in the California state budget that year. Meanwhile, the state began building an arsenal of arms donated by the United States Army. In 1852, United States Senator John Weller, who became California's governor in 1858, told his fellow United States senators that California Indians, quote, will be exterminated. He insisted, quote, the interest of the white man demands their extinction, end quote. That same year, having already spent $500,000, state legislators passed a $600,000 bond measure to support additional additional militia operations, even as vigilante killings continued. So what we're looking at here is one of these bonds. You can find copies of these bonds at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, and you can find many copies of these bonds in the California State Library, and the most number of these that I've found are in the California State Archives. So this is a bond for $250. This is probably either for a very wealthy person or for an institutional investor. Banks and insurance companies were major investors in these bonds. And what is missing here are the coupons at the bottom. They have all been cut off. So you would purchase the bond for the original $250. You can see they're all numbered in the upper left-hand corner, and we have records of all of the bonds ever issued and sold by the state of California in the state archives. And so you would bring this in and they would cut off with a knife or scissors the little coupons, and each one in this case would pay you a 7% interest premium. And then at the very end, you'd bring this in and they'd give you your $250 back. It was guaranteed and backed by the state of California, and as we shall see, ultimately by the federal government as well. The Sinkyone woman, Sally Bell, who we see here in one of the last years of her life, provided a rare California Indian eyewitness account of a massacre that took place in her homeland sometime during the middle 1850s. Bell remembered, and I quote, about 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister and cut her heart out and threw it into the brush where I ran and hid. My little sister was a baby, just crawling around. I did not know what to do. I was so scared that I guess I just hid there a long time with my little sister's heart in my hands, end quote. It was a terrifying time to be a California Indian person. The United States Congress endorsed such killing, even as state and federal leaders perfected California's killing machine. In the year 1854, the United States Congress allocated more than $924,000 to reimburse the state of California for its past militia campaigns. The following year, this man, State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William C. Kibbe, who ran California's militia system from 1852 through the end of 1863, underscored the California militia's genocidal purpose, and I quote, there are but two alternatives before us, viz., either to wage a war of extermination or to abandon a large and productive territory, end quote. To help perfect his killing machine, Kibbe wrote a tactical manual and distributed it to his militia officers. You can find copies of Kibbe's tactical manual in many California libraries. Meanwhile, then Secretary of War Jefferson C. Davis sent Kibbe U.S. Army tactical manuals to distribute to his officers as Christmas gifts. And in 1857, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for past and future militia operations with predictable results. Finally, in the year 1861, even as Southern states' secession was tearing the Union apart, the United States Congress overwhelmingly voted to appropriate another $400,000 to pay for additional California militia expeditions. While all of this was going on, civilians and officials also carried out large forced removal operations to concentrate surviving California Indian people on federal reservations. These operations were frequently lethal. For example, in 1856, vigilantes massacred 55 California Indian people while forcibly removing one group to the Mendocino Reservation. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoy Mut recollected that during the forced removal of her people to the Fresno Reservation, soldiers first killed a dozen Indian people and then shot a dozen more during the forced march. Likewise, the Nome Lackey man Andrew Freeman recollected that, and I quote, "When they took the Indians to the Round Valley Reservation, they drove them like stock and shot the old people who couldn't make the trip. They would shoot children who were getting tired." Once at federal reservations, California Indian people often encountered institutionalized malnutrition and lethal starvation. The Concow leader, Tomayanem, recollected that after volunteers had forcibly removed his people to the Mendocino Reservation, quote, "We were very hungry and the Concows began to die very fast," end quote. Other reservations proved little better. In about 1860, Tomayanem led his people to the Round Valley Reservation, where he recollected, and I quote, "There was even less to eat." Indeed, in 1860, Office of Indian Affairs officials typically provided 480 to 910 calories per day to working Round Valley Indians. By 1862, after Congress dramatically cut the budget for California Indian reservations by 25%, officials at Round Valley were providing just 160 to 390 calories per person per day. Further diminishing these already inadequate rations, those who did not work were infrequently fed, if at all. So if some California reservation inmates died of institutionalized starvation, malnutrition also weakened the immune systems of many others, making them dramatically more susceptible to lethal diseases. Starvation and malnutrition also predictably depressed fecundity while increasing miscarriages and stillbirths. Some reservation officials and colonists there also used reservation Indian people as unpaid laborers with lethal results. According to one colonist testifying under oath, and I quote, "About 300 died on the Round Valley Reservation during the winter of 1856 to 1857 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in the snow and mud. They were generally worked naked and packed 50 pounds each, if able," end quote. At California Indian reservations, willful neglect took an untold number of California Indian lives. Federal employees also killed large numbers of California Indian people in more direct ways. During the United States Civil War, 15,725 California men enlisted in the Union Army. Some 7,500 of them remained in California and soon transformed the killing machine. As US troops, these so-called California volunteers replaced relatively small, short-term militia campaigns with much larger, longer, better armed US Army operations. The Army now fielded the largest campaigns ever seen in California. Vigilante operations flourished alongside them, but the genocide was now primarily a federal project, and US Army forces killed substantial numbers. The first California Volunteers Army campaign in 1862 killed at the very least 120 Northern California Indian people. Hundreds more would perish in succeeding campaigns led by officers like this man, Colonel Henry M. Black. California Volunteers also slew prisoners en masse on multiple occasions. United States Cavalry Captain Moses McLaughlin, for example, proudly reported how in the year 1863, quote, "I had all the bucks collected together and 35 were either shot or sabered. None escaped." McLaughlin concluded, "They will soon either be driven off or pushed so far into the surrounding deserts that they will perish by famine." The United States Army continued killing California Indian people through the late 1860s. Even after officers concluded their last large-scale operation, the 1872-1873 Modoc War, they hanged and beheaded 4 surrendered Modoc leaders before shipping their severed heads to Washington, D.C. The California Indian catastrophe fits the 2-part legal definition set forth in the UN Genocide Convention. First, perpetrators demonstrated in both word and in deed their intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Second, they committed not one, but all 5 of the genocidal acts enumerated in the convention. Killing members of the group occurred in more than 370 recorded massacres, as well as hundreds of smaller killings, homicides, and executions. Sources indicate that from 1846 through 1873, vigilantes, state militiamen, and US soldiers killed an absolute minimum of 9,492 to 16,094 California Indian people, and probably many, many more. By way of contrast, California Indians killed fewer than 1,500 non-Indian people during this entire period. But it's important to understand that other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred. These meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policy of demolishing California Indian villages and their food stores while driving survivors into inhospitable desert and mountain regions amounted to deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Some United States Office of Indian Affairs officials administering federal Indian reservations in California committed the same genocidal crime. Further, because malnutrition and exposure predictably lower fertility while increasing the number of miscarriages and stillbirths, some state and federal policymakers also appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state, slave raiders, and federal officials were all involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. 3,000 to 4,000 or more California Indian children suffered such forced transfers. By breaking up families and shattering whole communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Sufficient evidence thus exists to designate the California Indian catastrophe a case of genocide, according to the UN definition. So who exactly is responsible? Elected California officials were the primary architects of annihilation. Legislators created a legal environment in which California Indian people had almost no legal rights, thus granting to those who attacked them virtual legal impunity. Moreover, 2 governors threatened annihilation, and both governors and elected officials cooperated in building a robust killing machine. California governors called out or authorized no fewer than 24 separate volunteer militia expeditions between 1850 and 1861, which killed a minimum of 1,342 California Indian people. State legislators also raised up to $1.51 million to fund these many operations. By demonstrating that the state would not punish Indian killers, but instead reward them, state militia expeditions inspired an even greater number of vigilante killings. Finally, in 1863, after the US Army supplanted the militias as the primary state-sponsored Indian killing force, California legislators passed yet another bill, this one allowing the state to raise an additional $600,000 to encourage more men to enlist as California volunteers in the Union Army. Yet the state of California did not act alone. The US Army played a crucial role in the California Genocide, first creating the exclusionary legal system under martial law, then setting genocidal precedents, helping to build the killing machine, participating in killing, and finally taking control of it. In total, US Army soldiers killed an absolute minimum of 1,688 to 3,741 California Indian people during these years. If state legislators were the architects of genocide, federal officials helped to lay the groundwork. They became the final arbiters of the design, and they ultimately paid for almost all of its official execution. By 1863, the US government had given California more than $1 million to pay for its militia operations. And of course, by 1863, the US Army had taken over as the primary state-sponsored killer, and Congress directly controlled that institution's budget. Indeed, federal officials paid for some or all of the many lethal campaigns against California Indians that began in 1846 and concluded in 1873. Like California Indians, Native American people across the United States suffered devastating population declines following the arrival of newcomers. Before contact, perhaps 5 million or more indigenous people inhabited what is now the continental United States. By 1900, US census takers counted fewer than 250,000 survivors. What caused this devastating catastrophe? Diseases, colonialism, and war all played important roles, but was something more sinister also to blame. Academics and others have long debated whether or not Native Americans or any groups of them suffered genocide during the conquest and colonization of the Americas. The question of genocide in United States history remains an important topic, given that the near obliteration of its indigenous peoples remains one of the formative events in our nation's history. As in many other Western Hemisphere countries, the Native American population cataclysm in the US played a foundational role in facilitating the conquest and colonization of millions of square miles. The rich real estate and cornucopia of natural resources on which this country, the wealthiest and most powerful on earth, was built. So, how we explain the Native American population cataclysm directly informs how we understand the making of these United States. Beyond interpretations of US history, the stakes are surprisingly similar to the stakes I laid out when we think about the question of genocide in California. Public acknowledgement, apology, reparations, natural resources, land, indigenous sovereignty, and national character. Now, despite the high stakes, this question of genocide in the United States remains largely unresolved. Now, two factors polarize what I call the American genocide debate. First, only some participants in this debate use the United Nations Genocide Convention as their definition, despite the fact that more than 150 countries have signed or are now parties to it, and a growing body of case law supports it. Just as important, many participants emphasize rendering a verdict of genocide or not genocide for all of United States history before and after 1776, or maybe they even want to look at the entirety of the Western Hemisphere from 1492 up to this present moment in which we're sitting right now. Across the United States, indigenous population declines took place at different rates over millions of square miles and across centuries. Colonial, state, and federal policymaking personnel changed over time, as did their government's indigenous policies. Moreover, thousands of different tribal entities were involved. The resistance and their accommodation strategies varied, and they changed over time. So despite the many published histories of violence against Native Americans, the details revealed by the California case strongly suggest the need for more local and regional studies to provide the data that will ultimately permit an assessment of genocide's occurrence, variability, and frequency or absence in other regions of the United States, in the United States as a whole, and elsewhere in the Americas, from Patagonia to the Arctic. Assessing the question of genocide in the United States and beyond without an agreed upon definition and a substantial number of detailed, robust case studies makes it very difficult to reach comprehensive conclusions. The direct and deliberate killing of California Indians in California between 1846 and 1873 was more lethal and more sustained than anywhere else in the United States or its colonial antecedents. Yet there remains a pressing need for additional detailed studies addressing other regions and indigenous peoples within and beyond the US. The variables present in the California genocide did not recur in precisely the same combination or at the same intensities in the histories of all other Native American nations. In some cases, disease may have been the overwhelming cause of mortalities. Both state and federal or colonial and metropolitan decision makers were not complicit in every case. Other Native American nations employed very different survival and resistance strategies. For example, fleeing contact zones or killing much larger numbers of colonizers than California Indians did. But what is useful about the UN Genocide Convention is that it provides us with a standardized, internationally recognized rubric and a coherent legal definition that can be consistently applied. My argument here is that scholars should use this definition to rigorously consider every potential case in consistent terms. Just as important, we should consider each on a case-by-case or region-by-region basis, not just in California, but nationally and internationally, to create a scholarly precision in our use of this politically explosive term, and to seriously evaluate the balance between variables like disease and the 5 categories of genocidal crimes described in the UNGC. So one of the things that I hope this book does is to point the field toward clear and consistent definitional standards and application. Detailed case studies, I would argue, are a very important element of genocide studies because case studies provide a very powerful tool with which to understand genocide and combat its denial and its repetition elsewhere around the world. Native American people experienced and reacted to conquest and colonization in varied ways. Rigorously examining the range of cases using the Genocide Convention to evaluate both genocidal intent and genocidal acts will help to move the discussion of genocide in the United States and the Western Hemisphere toward clarity. Unbraiding each region's story from the tapestry of American Indian history and bringing each one into sharper relief will create a clearer, more vivid portrait of Native American experiences and of Western Hemisphere history as a whole. Such investigations will be painful, but they will help all Americans, both Native and non-Native, to make more accurate sense of our past and ourselves. Thank you.